Hello and welcome back to the APUS History Curriculum for Era 8. In this video, we will be looking at America as a world power, which essentially means the expansion of the Cold War, both here at home and abroad. So let's get to it. While relations between the Soviet Union and the U.S. went through phases of increasing and decreasing tensions during the Eisenhower era, the Cold War advanced into new regions, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. Many countries were undergoing independence movements as the major imperial powers were backtracking on imperialism in the aftermath of World War II. Of course, that meant that many of these newly independent nations were experiencing political and social upheavals, and the U.S. saw this as a possibly inviting in foreign influence. And they were especially fearful of potential communist influence in these developing countries. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. In the early 1950s, a new regime had been elected in Guatemala that then began a campaign of land reform, resulting in government seizure of land owned by an American corporation called United Fruit Company, in order to redistribute it to the poor. This seemed too socialist to the Americans, so Secretary of State John Foster Dulles warned that such action was essentially communism, and this threatened the nearby Panama Canal, which the U.S. still owned. So Eisenhower allowed the CIA to plan a coup d'etat, or government overthrow, even though the new regime that was installed would bring decades of government oppression of the people. Similar action also occurred in Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro led an uprising to overthrow the American-backed government of Cuba, led by dictator Fulgencio Batista. Castro wanted to regain control of Cuba's economic resources, which meant nationalizing nearly $1 billion worth of American-owned property. He also signed a trade agreement with the Soviet Union, jailed his political opponents, and installed a communist regime. Eisenhower authorized the CIA to design a secret operation to overthrow the Castro regime, using anti-communist Cuban exiles, but he left office before the invasion could occur. The existence of communism in Cuba and its ties to the Soviets was particularly concerning to a lot of Americans, as Cuba is only 90 miles from the Florida coast, and if the Soviets ever decided to launch an attack directly on the U.S., Cuba seemed to be the logical originating point. It wasn't long before many Americans, fearful of atomic war, purchased bomb shelters that could be installed in the family backyard. In addition, it wasn't uncommon for cities and towns across the nation to practice air raid drills where citizens were encouraged to drop, duck, and cover as a form of protection against a nuclear attack. Once John F. Kennedy was elected in 1960 over Eisenhower's Vice President Richard Nixon, he decided to carry out the plan regarding Cuba. Kennedy expected the Cuban people would want to help overthrow Castro, but he was wrong. The exiles who had been trained for the invasion expected assistance by the U.S. Air Force in the form of air cover, but Kennedy didn't want to risk starting a larger war, so none was provided. In April of 1961, the invasion force of about 1,500 landed at the Bay of Pigs on the southwestern coast of the island. But there had been a significant underestimation of how much popular support Castro actually had, and so these insurgents were defeated in just 3 days. This proved to be a significant foreign policy defeat for the Kennedy administration. And just 2 months later, when Kennedy met with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev at a summit meeting, Khrushchev demanded that the U.S. help stop millions of refugees fleeing the communist Iron Curtain countries via Berlin. Kennedy refused and requested Congress increase defense spending. He decided the best way to prevent the Soviets from attacking the U.S. was to build so many missiles that even if the U.S. was attacked, the U.S. would be able to strike back because there's no way the Soviets would be able to destroy all of the weapons at once. In effect, we were creating a nuclear deterrent system. In response, that August, the Soviet Union sealed off East Berlin from West Berlin by first erecting a fence and then later a concrete wall 15 feet high. The Berlin Wall's purpose was to keep East Germans from fleeing to the West. However, the communists claimed that it was built to keep Westerners out in case of an invasion. In the summer of 1963, JFK would personally travel to Berlin, where in a speech before over 100,000 cheering Berliners, he reassured them of America's continuing support, saying, "Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put up a wall to keep our people in." He would go on to say, "All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. Therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, 'Ich bin ein Berliner.'" Kennedy gave his assurances that America would never abandon the people of West Berlin, and he would use America's military to protect them from communist aggression, should it be necessary. The year following the Bay of Pigs disaster, U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flying over Cuba detected military launch sites for missiles that was being constructed by Russian advisors. The location, again, 90 miles from the Florida coast. This touched off what became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy called an emergency meeting of his cabinet, and they discussed the several possibilities of U.S. intervention, ultimately deciding to challenge the Soviet Union. The U.S. Navy forming a blockade in the Caribbean, and announcing that all Soviet ships would be stopped and searched for any offensive weapons. Khrushchev threatened that the Soviets would rain down rockets on U.S. cities if any Russian ship was stopped, accusing JFK of piracy on the high seas. For 13 days, the world was on the brink of war. Americans began hoarding food, and American bombers were loaded up and ready to go, and 25,000 troops were placed on alert in Florida. Eventually, Khrushchev realized he really couldn't challenge JFK any further and ordered his ships to halt. Kennedy promised that the U.S. would not invade Cuba. He also ordered the dismantling of outdated missiles in Turkey, which, remember, this is located on the Soviet Union's border. Okay, so that's a look at some of the U.S. involvement in Latin America, but now let's shift attention to Africa and the Middle East, where significant attempts at decolonization had begun in the aftermath of World War II, promoting the self-determination that had been first insisted on as part of the Treaty of Versailles way back in 1919. This led to the emergence of nationalist movements, which in turn led both sides in the Cold War to seek allies among these new emerging nations. Many of the newly independent nations were cautious about aligning with either the U.S. or the Soviet Union, not wanting to be dragged into a Soviet-American conflict. Instead, they formed the non-aligned movement and sought to remain neutral and avoid becoming pawns in the superpower struggle, though there were various times when some built closer ties with one side or the other. The Cold War powers still tried to influence these regions, despite their desire to remain unaligned. One example resulted in the Suez Crisis. In 1956, Egypt's President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital shipping route, which angered Britain and France, who still had colonial interests in the region. They also feared that this could threaten Israel, which had fought a war with Egypt and other Arab nations in 1948. In response, in 1956, Israel, France, and Britain launched attacks against Egypt. The U.S. pressured them to cease military action as part of an effort to maintain good relations with Arab countries. The conflict eventually ended with a UN-brokered ceasefire, but tensions remained, and conflict returned several times throughout the 60s and 70s. Finally, in 1978, the U.S. sponsored talks between Egypt and Israel, hosted by President Jimmy Carter at the presidential retreat at Camp David. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat were the main figures in the negotiations. These discussions resulted in the Camp David Accords, which laid the groundwork for a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, which was signed in 1979. This treaty led to Israel withdrawing from the Sinai Peninsula, which it had occupied since the Six-Day War in 1967. The so-called problems in the Middle East weren't just limited to post-war decolonization, though. Iran had maintained its independence throughout the period of imperialism, but was facing significant internal conflicts and military coups after World War II. In 1953, an attempted coup against the Shah was blamed on the prime minister, who was associated with the Communist Party. He had sought to nationalize Iran's oil industry, which threatened the interest of the U.S. and other Western nations who had become increasingly reliant on oil as a vital economic resource. The U.S. hoped to reinstate Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to the throne because he was an ally to the U.S. and willing to ensure the uninterrupted flow of oil to the West. In exchange, the Shah would receive military aid for his regime. The CIA was successful in its plan, even though the Shah's regime would include political repression and suppression of dissent, and eventually became increasingly autocratic, leading to widespread discontent. By the late 1970s, economic struggles and growing dissent fueled widespread protests against the Shah. Various groups, including students, religious conservatives, and progressives, united to call for an end to the monarchy. Their chosen leader was the Ayatollah Khomeini, a Shiite cleric who had been exiled in Paris. The Shah was eventually ousted and fled to the United States, where he sought medical treatment for cancer. Angered by the U.S. decision to grant the Shah refuge, Iranian revolutionaries stormed the U.S. embassy in Tehran, taking hostages, whom they held for 444 days. This crisis overshadowed the end of President Jimmy Carter's administration. A failed U.S. rescue mission further compounded the situation, contributing to Carter's loss in the 1980 election to Ronald Reagan. On the day of Reagan's inauguration, the hostages were finally released. This event highlights how Iran sought to influence U.S. domestic policies, just as Iranians believed the U.S. had interfered in their own affairs throughout the 20th century. But this pattern of intervention reflects the geopolitical dynamics at the time, where strategic interests in natural resources and geopolitical alliances often superseded the principles of democracy and self-determination. Still another example, although it's not actually in this region, was in Southeast Asia with the former French colony of Indochina, otherwise known as Vietnam. The area had fought against Japanese occupation during World War II, and then the French tried to reassert control, but lost. In the aftermath, Vietnam was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel until free elections could be held. The North came under the influence of the communist Ho Chi Minh, while the South remained democratic. By the way, this should sound a lot like what happened in Korea, but we'll come back to this one in a later topic. With all the tensions brought on by the possibility of nuclear war, inevitably there would be those who wanted to scale back U.S. nuclear activities. Throughout the 1950s, scientists in the U.S., the Soviet Union, and even Britain had been conducting experiments of more and more powerful weapons. In 1959, radioactive deposits were found in wheat and milk in the northern United States. As scientists and the public gradually became aware of the dangers of radioactive fallout, they began to raise their voices against nuclear testing. As early as 1955, there were attempts to negotiate an end to nuclear testing, but the Soviet Union feared that on-site inspections could lead to spying that might expose the Soviets' vastly exaggerated claims of the number of deliverable nuclear weapons. In the meantime, both countries suspended nuclear tests, a moratorium that lasted until September of 1961. After being elected, President Kennedy had pledged not to resume testing in the air and promised to pursue all diplomatic efforts for a test ban treaty, but began more testing once it was revealed that the Soviets had exploded the largest nuclear bomb in history, 58 megatons, more than 4,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped at Hiroshima. Eventually, though, the two superpowers signed a limited nuclear test ban treaty in September of 1963 that would prohibit nuclear weapons tests or other explosions underwater, in the atmosphere, or in outer space, although it would allow underground testing so long as no radioactive debris fell outside their national boundaries. 33 years later, the UN General Assembly adopted a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty that was signed by 71 nations, prohibiting all nuclear test explosions. The next major development in the nuclear arms race was the creation of ballistic missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads to their targets. When the Soviet launched the Sputnik satellite, the U.S. became very fearful because it demonstrated that if they could send something into space, they also had the capability to launch a missile at the U.S. before it could be intercepted. As both the Soviets and the U.S. continued to build their nuclear arsenals, they approached what became known as mutually assured destruction. This doctrine meant that if one country launched an attack, the attacked country would retaliate with equal force. The sheer destructiveness of these weapons guaranteed massive devastation and a high number of casualties. In his farewell address, President Eisenhower warned about the growing influence of the military-industrial complex. He referred to the increasing spending on military equipment and the close relationship between the government, the military, and the defense industry. This interconnectedness, he feared, could lead to unnecessary defense spending, with the defense industry pushing for further arms buildup. Eisenhower's warning was particularly significant as he left office, and it seemed almost prophetic given U.S. foreign policy treated the Soviet Union and communism as significant threats. In this environment, it became more difficult to prevent the military-industrial complex from expanding. In the late 1960s and 70s, the U.S. and the Soviets entered into a series of discussions called the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks to curb the arms race by limiting the number of nuclear weapons each superpower could possess. The first round of talks from 1969 to 1972 led to the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, or ABM Treaty, and an interim agreement on strategic offensive arms. This was a significant step in controlling the arms race and reducing the risk of nuclear conflict. A second round of talks began in 1972, lasting through 1979, and sought to build on that agreement, further limiting strategic nuclear weapons. Although the SALT II treaty was signed, it was never ratified by the U.S. Senate due to rising tensions between the two superpowers. These negotiations were crucial, though, in showing that diplomacy could be used to manage the nuclear threat, reflecting both public demand for safety and international pressure for peace. Well, that about covers what you need to know for topic 8.7. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.